we're at the Aviation Nation 2004 Air Show, which is the Nellis Air Force Base open house, world recognized as one of the premier air shows and popular with people of all ages.
Everybody takes pride when we come up with a new advancement in aviation. They feel like it's their advancement too. People love flight.
Pilots like myself owe a lot to people like Howard Hughes, because in those days they were always on the edge no matter what they were doing, because they didn't know enough to really be confident in their own mind that they were doing the right thing.
I don't know a lot of the pioneers by name, but I know what they did because they're the ones that found out what you could and couldn't do. They were the ones that stuck their neck out the furthest, and Howard Hughes was one of those. He was starved for answers to problems in aviation.
Howard Hughes became very interested in aviation at a very young age. He was like 14 years old. His father made arrangements for him to get a flight in a Curtiss seaplane. Howard went up in the airplane, his father went with him, and Howard developed a great love of aviation, and in particular seaplanes, just from that single event. His father went along with him, but his father got sick, so it kind of shows the difference in personalities. He didn't care for aviation at all.
Howard Hughes' father made a multi-million-dollar fortune from inventing a drill bit wherein they could excavate oil from the earth, and his father passed away when Howard was a teenager. His mother passed away when he was also very young, so he essentially arrived in Hollywood with millions and millions of dollars in his pocket and was somewhat reckless and fearless in the way he made films, and made the first multi-million-dollar film ever, and that was Hell's Angels.
Here's a combination of aviation and movies. What could be better than that? And so he went into this, as Howard did everything, in a big, big way. He bought some 80 airplanes. He invested $4 million of his own money in this movie.
Hell's Angels became Hughes' first great obsession. He saw aviation along with film as the two great new American industries.
And there were a lot of smart people in the Hollywood area that said he'll never get his money back. But it was a big hit. When it was over, he had a lot of airplanes. And so this was a real boost in his interest in aviation.
I became interested in where he was the most active, which was in aviation, and decided that the best way to approach the character was through his involvement with aviation, from the early biplanes of Hell's Angels to the reconnaissance plane of the XF-11, and finally the Hercules, the Spruce Goose, the largest plane ever flown. He was constantly a man willing to risk his entire fortune on a dream.
This plane has been constructed during the last year and a half for a design competition for Army pursuit planes in this country. We think it'll be not only faster than any racing plane ever built in this country, but also faster than any pursuit ship or other military plane in any country whatsoever.
In 1935, Hughes set his first speed record in his H-1 Racer, where he set a new land speed record of 352 miles an hour.
The quest for speed has been there from the Wright brothers, really. Everybody wanted to go a little faster and a little further. And Howard Hughes set high water marks throughout his early years in flying by doing just that. And that racer that he designed, it is so smooth. The surfaces, you can't even tell where they join. The rivets have no heads. And every part of that airplane worked to perfection.
He introduced to it a number of innovations, but probably the most remarkable thing in it was retractable landing gear. Hughes and others saw that if you can get those to come up, that would substantially increase the speed of the plane.
He ended up flying the airplane until it ran out of gas.
There goes our meal ticket.
Come on! He didn't want to bail out of the airplane because he had invested about $100,000 of his own money in it, so he landed gear up in a beet field.
His ground crew and everybody ran up to him to see if he was hurt or what's going on, how bad the plane was injured. Hughes climbed out of it and said almost matter-of-factly, it'll go faster.
In 1936, he set a transcontinental record going non-stop from Burbank to Newark in 9.5 hours, and he flew at night. The following year, 1937, did another transcontinental flight, this time in 7.5 hours. Howard was interested in pushing the limit, and he got a lot of respect from other pilots because he was willing to go out and essentially risk his life, not for the dollars. He was already wealthy. He didn't need the money. He just wanted to set records in aviation.
Aviation was almost like traveling into outer space. It was unheard of to fly around the world. It was considered extremely dangerous. And he was one of the first guys to say, let's bring these airplanes into the substratosphere. Let's bring it above the weather.
He understood early on that if you could take an airplane higher, you would not only get out of rough weather, but you would probably be able to fly faster and farther on less fuel. And he actually set up a number of experiments in Southern California, in the Los Angeles basin, testing this out, where he placed his various people on the ground, and they were clocking him there versus what he was showing on the airspeed indicator in his cockpit. And from that, he proved conclusively that when you fly at a higher altitude, you're flying much faster than the gauges at the time were recording you. This had enormous implications for commercial aviation.
Smashing all records, Howard Hughes outdoes Jules Verne's wildest dreams. Around the world from New York to New York in 4 days.
This was the absolute zenith of Hughes' fame as an aviator. The public was mesmerized by anybody who flew across the ocean. It was so daring, it was so dramatic. But Hughes was not caught up in that. What he wanted to do was to plan a flight that was the most scientifically, technologically based flight of its time. What he did was actually map out the flight step by step. Every place he was going to be, the time he was going to land there. He wanted to show that as daring as flying around the world is, it could be a very scientifically plotted out and planned enterprise.
About 6-7 months later, Howard Hughes became interested in TWA. He bought part interest in an airline. And then he transferred this passion that he had in long-distance flying into what he wanted to build was the greatest airline in the world.
He and some engineers at Lockheed began working on plans for a long-range passenger plane, a prop plane. And they came up with, in the war, a plane called the Constellation.
He invented the idea of a cross-country flight with no stops. It had not been done until he got together with Jack Fry TWA and Bob Gross of Lockheed and said, let's build a plane that flies above the weather and can fly nonstop coast to coast and then can continue to fly around the world.
It revolutionized air travel because it was such a beautiful plane. All you had to do was look at a Constellation and you just were swept up in the beauty of aviation.
One of the fascinating aspects of Howard Hughes' life are the contradictions that run through it. The aviation part of his life was really emblematic of that. Here you have this man who sets all of these speed records, who receives all of this acclaim, and what tends to go unnoticed off to the side is the fact that he was involved in 4 plane crashes, 3 of which were really very serious.
Howard Hughes made a major mistake when he did the first flight of the XF-11 reconnaissance aircraft. He had developed the airplane. It was under contract with the old Army Air Corps. The Army Air Corps had precise flight test plan for the first flight. Howard ignored essentially all of the requirements of the Army. He had twice as much fuel on board the aircraft as the Army had restricted him to. He was supposed to fly the first flight with the landing gear down. He retracted the landing gear. He was supposed to fly for 45 minutes. He ended up flying for about 1 hour 20. What Howard did not know is that he had an internal oil leak in the right engine rear propeller. So Howard was now in an emergency situation, and every pilot learns that if you have an in-flight emergency, first thing you do is notify people of the emergency, and you land at the nearest airport that is available for your airplane. If Howard had done that, he could have come back to Culver City, he could have landed at Santa Monica. But Howard Hughes was his own type of person. And what he liked to do, according to Jimmy Kirkpatrick, who I interviewed, is Howard wanted to stay airborne and always troubleshoot. He didn't want to land and have the mechanics and the engineers tell him what went wrong. He wanted to land and tell them what went wrong.
A short time after his takeoff, he radioed trouble. Then, trying to make a forced landing on a golf course, he was gravely injured when he undershot and crashed into a residential area in Beverly Hills. 2 people narrowly missed death when a wing of the plane sliced through their room. Even as globe-circling Howard Hughes fought for his life, he was reported planning greater and faster airplanes.
That flight was the start of the downfall of Howard Hughes. That's the case where he ended up being in the hospital and where he ended up getting on morphine for pain and later codeine as he left the hospital. But it was the downturn of Howard Hughes, and it had an effect upon him the rest of his life.
I think the perception was one of overwhelming enthusiasm for Howard Hughes, and in the process, the crashes tended to be overlooked.
Hughes was a loner in many ways. One of the things that he loved to do, he loved to take one of his planes up in the daytime, fly in lazy circles over the Los Angeles basin. At night, he loved to fly way out over the ocean and then turn around and come back toward LA and watch the lights of the city come into view. And nothing made him happier than to be up in a cockpit, listening to the purr of the engines, just being lost in kind of the reverie of aviation.
Howard Hughes cared deeply about many of his airplanes. The H-1, that beautiful racing plane, the XF-11, that's a magnificent reconnaissance plane that he crashed in, the Constellation, the great commercial airliner that was the bedrock of the TWA service. I believe he cared about no plane as much as the Hercules.
Can white elephants really fly? That's everybody's question.
When you look at the plane and you think, oh my, what a white elephant, what a grotesque, huge, why would anyone build such a huge, impractical plane? It's easy to dismiss it as just this strange, obsessive fantasy of Howard Hughes. The reality is there was a true need for it. You have to remember that the Spruce Goose was built during World War II, where ship convoys were being destroyed in the North Atlantic by German U-boats. So a steel magnate named Henry Kaiser came up with the idea of saying, what about a plane that could fly the troops to England and to Europe? It would be much safer than the U-boats. And he went to Hughes. Hughes immediately said, absolutely, that is a worthwhile goal. So the genesis, the idea behind the Hercules, was very sensible.
Hughes, all through World War II, built the Hercules, this giant wooden flying boat. It was derisively called by some the Spruce Goose, which is a name that he despised.
He was obsessed with that plane, with wanting to advance the cause of aviation by creating a transportation device that could move huge amounts of people around the world.
He was chided by many government folks at the end of the war for building this thing that had made no contribution to national defense. It was sort of a dead-end plane. Hughes went through a very acrimonious congressional hearing in 1947, and right after that hearing, he went back to Los Angeles and he said, basically, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to fly that airplane. And the idea was he was just going to taxi it across Long Beach Harbor. But as everybody was watching, Hughes lifted it off, flew it for about a mile, set it down. It was woefully underpowered because it needed jet engines to really fly anything of that size. But the fact that Hughes would even do this is sort of a key to his personality. He was always doing the impossible. The Hercules was really the Mount Everest of plane making, if you think about this. I mean, it's still to this day the largest airplane ever built. And it really goes to the heart of why Hughes was such an extraordinary individual.
To a certain degree, every time you fly from Los Angeles to New York, nonstop, every time you fly from Los Angeles to New York to England, you owe that to Howard Hughes. Every time you fly at 20,000 feet above the turbulence in a pressurized plane, you owe that to Howard Hughes. The man was absolutely instrumental in commercial aviation.